And with that, we're almost done for this section, but there are a couple of essential features that we'll use in this course and a couple of tricky features, which I also want to refresh here so that you know about these JavaScript concepts and features and you don't wonder about them when you encounter them later in the course. The first JavaScript feature you should be aware of is that you can pass functions as values to other functions. For example, we could set a timer with help of the built-in setTimeout function, a function that is provided by the browser. Now, setTimeout wants two input values. It accepts two parameters. The first input value it wants is a function itself, though. A function that can be defined with the function keyword or as an arrow function. Now, what's really important to understand here is that what we're doing here is we're creating a new function. An anonymous function here, since it has no name, but nonetheless a function. And we could absolutely create that function manually in a separate step. It could be named handle timeout or anything like this. And here we could console log timed out. So this would now be a regular function. And we could also alternatively define it as an arrow function. Could be named handle timeout2. And we store an arrow function in that constant because arrow functions never accept a name in front of them. They always are created in an anonymous way, but we can make them non-anonymous by then storing them in a constant or a variable that has a certain name. And then here I could console log timed out again. Anything like this. So here I'm creating a function with the function keyword or as an arrow function stored in a constant. And we can now also pass this function or this constant that contains a function as a value to set timeout. So as a value for this first parameter that wants a function instead of defining the function right here in place, which would be an alternative though. Now, what's really important to understand here when you're passing a function to another function, though, is that when you're not defining it here in place, but instead you defined it in advance, you pass it by just using its name. So you don't add parentheses here. You omit those parentheses. Because by just using the name here, you're passing the function as a value to this function. If you would add parentheses here, you would instead make sure that this function, handle timeout here, gets executed immediately at the point of time when this timer is set, in this case here, and therefore it would be the return value of that function, if it would return any value, which this one does not, that would be passed as a value for this first argument, this first parameter, to set timeout. And that, of course, would be the wrong thing to do here, because here I don't want to pass the return value of that function to set timeout, but instead the function itself. So that internally, set timeout can execute this function at some point in the future. And that's why you must omit the parentheses here, so that you don't execute this function right away, and you instead pass the function as a value to set timeout. Well, and then here, setTimeout takes a second argument as well, which is now not a function, but instead a number, which defines the number of milliseconds JavaScript should wait until it executes this function, which you passed as a first argument to setTimeout. And I can, of course, also do that with handle timeout too. Now, just to be clear, you can always create an anonymous function instead of defining a function in advance. And then you could, of course, also add any code you want to execute to that. But when you define such an anonymous function, you're also not executing it yet. Instead, you're also just defining it, and you're passing that defined function to set timeout. So you're in the end doing the same as you're doing here by defining it in advance and passing a handler to that function, the name of the function, to set timeout. You're essentially doing the same here when defining the function in the place where it's needed. You're still only defining it. You're not executing it immediately. Well, and therefore here, if you save that and you reload, You'll see nothing initially, but then once these timers expire, you will see the different messages they output. Now, knowing that you can pass functions as values to other functions is an important first step. But you should not think that this is only possible for built-in functions like setTimeout. Instead, you can also build your own function, like greeter, for example, which accepts a greet function parameter, so a regular parameter in the end, but a parameter which expects to get a function as a value. And then inside of greeter, we could execute greet function like this, so calling it as a function by adding these parentheses. And now we could call greeter like this and pass a function to greeter. Like for example here, an arrow function where I console log hi. If I do that and save everything and reload this page and open this console, you will see hi here. And this hi is of course coming from this console log message. So this function here is getting executed because we're passing it as a value for this greetFN parameter to the greeter function. And inside of that greeter function, I'm then executing this greetFN parameter. So the value that's received on that parameter, which is this function. So this function down here is passed as a value to greetFN. And then greetFN is executed here. Therefore, indirectly, this function is getting executed there. Because this function down there at the bottom is the value received here on greetFN. And I just wanted to mention this here because it really is important to be aware of the fact that passing functions as values is not limited to built-in functions like setTimeout, but can be done with all functions, including your own functions. Those can also accept functions as input.